The piece I'm doing today, Reb Yaakov clearly has an agenda, and I hope that you guys will figure it out because it's really clear, though he never really says what the agenda is. Reb Yaakov Kamenetsky sort of gives it away in a footnote, but I like to read through it. Part of it I heard from Reb Yaakov, part of it I never heard from Reb Yaakov, and it goes like this: Hafach libam l'sno amo lehisnakel ba'avadav. That's a very famous pasuk in Tehillim. That's on page Shin Pei Ches, towards the bottom of the left. So hafach libam l'sno also means God turned their hearts, the hearts of the Egyptians. If you look in the whole chapter over there, it's dealing with the Jews in Mitzrayim. The Jews in Mitzrayim got very strong. The Lashon over there is, where's it, in Kuf Hey, right? The Lashon is like this. Tilim Kuf Hey. Yeah. Talking about Egypt over there, Jews going down to Egypt. And then it says, Vayefer es amo ma'od, vayatzimehu mitzarav, hafach libam l'snoa amo. Yaakov, it says, went down to Egypt, and the Jewish people, the way he translates it is, and he made the nation exceedingly fruitful, from the word, pruruvu. And then they became very stronger than their oppressors. Now, the Radak learns the oppressors that were going to eventually be, because when they first became strong, they weren't being oppressed. So it says over there that Hafach, here one second, Hafach libam l'sno amo. He turned their hearts to hate his nation. So it sounds a little bit like the Jewish people became very strong, and then there was anti-Semitism, which, by the way, we do find things like this in our world for many hundreds of years. When the Jews become too powerful, even though I don't think there's really an intention of the Jews to either become powerful or to take over anything, but they're viewed as they become very powerful after a certain amount of time, meaning it doesn't matter. I don't mean powerful like army-wise, it's powerful just in the amount of, finance, science, medicine, that's also power. So when the Jews become very powerful, the nations begin to hate us. That's what it sounds like over here. The Medrash doesn't learn that way, okay? And this Medrash led many people, okay, many Gedolei Yisrael in the Dor of Achronim, never found it in the Rishonim, but in the Dor of Achronim, to define anti-Semitism exactly the opposite of way the Anti-Defamation League defines anti-Semitism. The Anti-Defamation League defines it as, right, the nation has a problem that the Jews are in, and instead of fixing it, they blame the Jews. Okay? In other words, it could be an economic problem, a social problem, whatever it is, right? So fix it. You have a problem, so fix it. Do something else. No, let's blame the Jews. Let's not take responsibility for it. That's the way Rabbi Sachs always defined anti-Semitism is. It's not really about the Jews. It's about the Goyim who refuse to admit that they've done anything wrong, so they have to blame somebody else. And of course, the scapegoat is the Jews. It's a little bit, it sounds like this in the Meshech Chochmah, and in the Beis HaLevi, the famous Beis HaLevi, the Rabbi Yoshe Brisker, Reb Soloveitchik's great grandfather, and in his Sefer Shilas Teshuvos Beis HaLevi, he has drashot, and one of the drashot, he also, I think, quotes this Chazal, and he says, according to Chazal, it's just the opposite. The Jews are the ones that cause anti-Semitism, because God wants to separate Jews that begin to assimilate. In order to stop the assimilation, you need anti-Semitism. So it's God causing the anti-Semitism because of the Jews doing something wrong. So it's really almost the opposite of the other definition. Okay, so this is what he says over here. Hamedrash Omer, ala pasuk hazeh kishemeis Yosef heferu bris milah. When Yosef died, they stopped doing the bris milah. Okay, now there is a place of getting a shmos that says, Reb Yaakov says, when everybody died, vayomas Yosef chol achov chol adorahu. But the Medrash says, this is the only text I ever saw in the Medrash, that when Yosef died, they feared bris milah, which is interesting because, I mean, they still had the other shvatim around. Amru niyeh k'Mitzrayim. Let's be like Mitzrayim. V'kiven she'asu kach hafach HaKadosh Baruch Hu ha'ava shehayu ha'Mitzrayim olavim otam l'sinah. Very clear. The Medrash says very, very clear.
We looked at something like this during the 3 weeks.
Right. This is going to be a little bit different, and here we learned we looked at that piece in Shmos. This is going to be a little bit different because Reb Yaakov's agenda here is a little bit different. Okay, and you'll be able to tell the agenda. Okay, so it's clear that he says it very clear. The Medrash says very clearly, right, that when they stopped doing Brit Milah, right, God turned the love of the Egyptians for the Jews into hate. Very clear. You stop keeping Brit. What does Brit Milah mean? Right? Brit Milah means, right? Rav Soloveitchik always says, why is there 2 brachas on Brit Milah? Al mitzvahs Milah, right? Limol, you only need, it's a mitzvah, right? So make a brachas on mitzvah, like on lulav, on tefillin. Why do you have lachnisa b'bris shel Avram Avinu? So he says there's 2 mitzvahs. There's one doing the mitzvah of Taryag mitzvahs, and the other one, bris milah, represents more than just any mitzvah. It represents the separation of the Jews to the other nations. And that's, you make a bracha on that. When the child is mal, he's already separated from the other nations. Till then he was not. So he says, so Reb Yaakov says, right, here, one second. Lisnakel means to plot against his servants, meaning that's what Paro did. Right? Let's plot against the Jews. Ayin Sham. Okay, that's the Medrash. So the Medrash says very clearly how anti-Semitism gets started. When the Jews try to assimilate, which bris milah is definitely a central idea in assimilation, looking mamish like the guy, right? Getting rid of the bris kodesh with tamua. Shorei pasuk b'dvarim vayisham legoy darshu chazal malamet shayu mitziyanim. So there's a contradiction, Rabbi Yaakov says, because in what we read in the Megillah, in the Haggadah, right? Vayisham legoy gadol chazal darshan malamet shahayu mitziyanim. That's what it says in the Haggadah Shel Pesach, right? What does Mitziyanim mean? They were outstanding. Upirshu, and the Midrashim are mafarish, and the Rishonim learn like this in the Haggadah Shel Pesach. Shayu malbusham umachalam ulashonam mishunim min hamitzriim. Another Mitziyanim means that they were outstanding in the way they looked, what they ate, the way they spoke, right? They kept the Hebrew language. They kept their malbushim shel Yehudim, right? Misumanim hayu v'yeduim shehem goy levadem, right? Choluk min hamitzriim. Okay? They were misumanim, means, siman is like to be recognized and known that they are a guy different than the Egyptians. This is all Midrashim that Rabbi Yaakov is quoting. Meaning, so you see from over there that the Jewish people looked very different. V'imkein yesh kantarti desasri. Shemitzad echad hoyu muvdola min hamitzriyim b'svasam uvemalbusham The Medrash lists off 3 or 4 things, how they were different. They maintained that difference. Okay? How did the 2 fit together? How you mavatal the mitzvah of Mila, which is such essential mitzvah to being looking like a Jew and being separated from the other nations that don't have bris Mila, right? That makes us very different, and we see time and time again in the Torah. We can't marry into you until you have a bris Mila. We had it in last week's parsha, right? Which Chem, right? So Mila was a very serious idea for the Jewish people. It was a foundational idea from Avraham Avinu, and the nations, for them, it was completely crazy. They would never do something like this. I mean, Shem and Machamor had to convince their countrymen to do this, right? So how could it be that the people are giving into such a central idea of making them different than the other nations about bris milah, and at the same time look different? You're telling me the guy wore a stribal and a kapota, but he didn't have a bris milah? It's mashug, right? That's Reb Yaakov's question. Okay. ומצד שני, אמרו נהיה כמצרים, וביטלו מצוות מיל, ועל זה כוסף כאן, בפסוק שהפך השם ליבם לשנוא את עם ישראל, את עמו ישראל, right? I don't think it says Am Yisrael, it says Amo Yisrael. Anyway, so the point over here is that Reb Yaakov has a contradiction, right? And there's a lot of ways probably to answer this question, but Reb Yaakov has his way to answer this. And here comes the agenda. Venera. This must be a mistake. Ha-misumanim ha-chitzoniyim ha-samimanim. Samimanim sounds more like...
Yeah, no, that's how you say it in modern Hebrew.
You do? Ha-samimanim?
Samimanim, yeah.
Samimanim, okay. Because this was taken from a Yiddish-speaking speech. Reb Yaakov didn't write this, you can imagine. Reb Yaakov Kamenetsky wrote it. So that's the way you say it. The recognition, superficial recognitions, right? Shel safa shemot umalbushim liyos shonim min hamitzriyim hoyi kol zeh. Listen to this. This was nothing to do with nothing to do with holiness, right? Bitui lemin le'umayut, to nationalism, right? In other words, this fact that they didn't change, right, into they didn't look like the Egyptians with their speech and with the way they dressed and what they ate, didn't have to do with a Torah ideology and had to do with nationalism, Reb Yaakov says.
But that's really harif, because why would we put it in the Haggadah then?
So and the Haggadah says b'shvil arba dvarim elu, they were niglu mitzrayim. I mean, right. That's pretty strange, right? That's the question Reb Yaakov Kamenetsky asks, and he answers it. And I'm positive Reb Yaakov said it that way, the way he answers it. We'll see in a minute. I don't know if we will get there at the end of the paragraph. We'll get to 74. The Hainu Sharotzu Leos Amiyuchat v'nifrad min hamitzrayim min hamitzrayim. They wanted to be a separate nation. Avalo ben abchina ruchanit shel atov v'chartonu mikol hamim v'kidash mitzvaysecha. They didn't want to be different in that sense. Ela adarabah leos am kechol ha'amim. We want to be like all the nations, right? Like it says in Yecheskel, right? Nia kechol hagoyim. Umebchina ruchanit liyot domim leMitzrayim. We want to be mitzad ruchanit. We want to be like all the nations. We want to be different, right? V'lachem bitlu et the bris hamila ki inyan ruchani, because it is an inyan ruchani. Ubazelo hayu unyanim liyoshonim min hamitzrayim bin hamitzrayim. In that sense, that has to do with ruchaniyut, the bris milah, right? That we're different in the fact that we are a separate and special nation, right? That they weren't interested. Lo munyanim bazeh liyoshonim min hamitzrayim umisharu musaolam Ulam lo rotzu lihikama b'Mitzrayim v'leapach l'Mitzrayim. They didn't want to assimilate into Egypt and become the nation, part of the nation of the Egyptian nation. Bazeh shamru al zehut lumit shoneh shel ivrim. In this, they guarded their tudat zehut, right? Their zehut, their, what do you call it, identity, right? Their national identity, different than the Egyptians. By the way, Reb Yaakov doesn't say this, but it answers up a question. Why did Egypt start thinking that the Jews are going to rebel? Because since they didn't melt into the melting pot, according to Reb Yaakov, nationalistically, they didn't want to melt. So, wow, nationalism, that's treif, right? That for any nation sees another nation as nationalistic, right? That's treif, right? So that question becomes answered according to Reb Yaakov. What was the king paranoid? Maybe not so paranoid, okay? But that's what Reb Yaakov says, that with regard to Kedusha, that's bris milah. With regard to lumaniyut, that's how I dress, how I look, what I eat. I eat falafel. I eat, I eat kichel and herring, whatever it is. Right? That's the Jewish thing. Okay, so we still have the question. So what do you mean the Jewish people were nigalu mitzrayim b'schut these things? I mean, if it's only lumaniyut, right? That Rabbi Yosef in 74 is going to ask. But before we even get there, right? Before we get there, what is the agenda of Reb Yaakov over here?
Well, he's anti-Zionist. He's a good anti-Zionist.
Very clear. You can't miss it. Okay, right? He's saying that's Zionism. It's nationalism, but it's without Kedushas Yisrael, without Kedushas HaTorah, right? We're like all the other nations. In fact, I think they say it in the name of Ben Gurion. I never saw it, but I've heard it a number of times. Ben Gurion said we won't be a normal nation until we have thieves, murderers, and prostitutes. That won't be a normal nation.
That is often quoted, yes.
Is it true? Is that what he said?
I'm not sure he said it. I think it might have been one of the famous Zionist, more secular Zionist writers.
Okay, no, but the point is, that's nationalism. We want to be just like the other nations, but we want to be a little bit different because, like every nation is different. The Poles are different than the Litvaks, and the Russians are different than the Indians, right? So we also want to have our own distinct look, an own distinct safa, right?
Culture.
What?
Culture.
Excellent. Culture, exactly.
But lack thereof.
Right. But mitzvos, chas v'shalom.
But Rav Shurin, what would we have?
Yeah.
Sorry,
yes.
Max, did you want to say something?
Go ahead. Right. So I told you, Rabbi Soloveitchik said, I sing the Hatikva, but I don't say Lios Am Klavshi, I say Lios Am Kadosh. I changed the word to Lios Am Kadosh when I sing it. That's exactly the Rabbi Yaakov right here.
Sure.
Yeah.
What would we have expected differently from them at this point in time? They have been just undergoing hundreds of years of slavery. They didn't have any mitzvahs at that point in time. They were at the 49th level of Tumah.
Well, we shouldn't say they didn't have any mitzvahs. They had the mitzvah of Milah, right? They had Shem mitzvahs B'Enoch, and the mitzvah of Milah they definitely had, and probably Gid Anosha they also had, right? So they had some mitzvahs.
But they didn't keep them, meaning they weren't keeping them because they were on that low level already that they had lost all that connection. So
right. No, but of course the question is that we always ask, or if they lost all the connections, so what do you mean b'schus arba dvarim? Why would they do that? So Reb Yaakov is explaining that medrash in a very chiddishtik way. So chiddishtik that we're going to have to answer the problem with Reb Yaakov, meaning he's explaining it. That was nationalistic. And you see that because of your statement here, it's almost machruf. Because you're saying, listen, what do you want from the Jews? They hundreds of years, they're in a place, they didn't have a Torah yet, right? That's why Moshe Rabbeinu actually came to them. We said last week that Moshe Rabbeinu came and he wanted them to study certain things, right? and then he wanted to take them out for an NCSY weekend right? No, you're right 100%, right? But then, right, how is it possible that people like this care about language? They care about wearing a kapota. They care about what they eat, right? So the answer, Rabbi Yaakov says, they cared about it nationalistically, not kedusha-wise.
But we're always taught. It's a very strange thing because we're always taught that door. Okay, but what Baruch is saying is true, right? They're at a very low level, but somehow or another, Hashem decided B'cholzot to take them out. And if you think about it, that's almost like a vote of confidence. Like, they always say that Rav Kook said, all the Chilonim who built the highways and they did all these good things, right? So
right.
Maybe they also did good things in Mitzrayim. They kept themselves Jewish somehow enough.
So Rabbi Yaakov was agreeing with you. He's just defining what does it mean being Jewish. Did it mean like Kedusha? No, he says it meant nationalistically, that they maintained, which is something.
But it's such an indictment. I thought that they were special. I don't know. Okay.
You thought the Jews were special? I mean, according to many commentators, he took them out because they were going to get up to, they were Memte Shari Tum already.
Right.
And there would be no one else to take out. So,
Chamushim.
What? Right.
Chamushim.
Yeah. Chamushim, exactly. Okay. Ulachora Kasha, the Reb Yaakov Kamenetsky now, 74. Ulachora Kasha, al differ Rabbeinu, Dim Ken Ketzad Omrim, right? And he brings all these different mafarshim. B'shem medrash Chazal b'schus shlosha dvarim. Some Chazal b'shlush arba shlosha yotzu avaseidim in Mitzrayim shloshinu levusham shemosam ulashonam. V'chem mafurish b'mechilta uvaod harbe mekomos sheb'schus shloshinu lashonam v'shemosam nigalu b'Mitzrayim. V'arei heim lo asu kein el b'china lumanit v'lo l'shem mitzvahs Hashem. So what kind of business is this? That's a schus? So Rabbi Yosef says exactly what I think Rabbi Yaakov would say. I never heard it from Rabbi Yaakov, but this is what he would say. He's talking about the kivin, the self dvarim elu b'poel. Shamru aleihem, shelo yitamu b'mitzrayim, or mitzrayim, that this, sof kol sof, helped, that they guarded themselves, that they didn't assimilate into Egypt. Haresha b'schusam nigalu. So even though it wasn't the reason we're looking for, lumaniyut, right? A nationalistic, that's not what we're searching for, but that nationalism kept them different. And that's important.
You told me that your grandfather said if it wasn't for the Medina, a lot of people would have assimilated.
That's where Rabbi Yosef quotes you right now.
Oh, really?
Take a look at the brackets. Okay? Rabbeinu Haya Tamid Omer, Shekemat Chatzi Million Yehudim Nisharu B'Sof Milchemet Olam Hashniya, that almost 500,000 Jews were left in the B'Machanot HaKorim, in displaced persons, right? Aladmas, Germania, right? You remember those displaced persons? Like a lot of people got married there. I have a lot of friends whose parents met there. They were single after the Holocaust, after the concentration, and they got married, right? By the way, the Chappelles met there, and they got married in displaced persons camp. It's just that Mrs. Chappelle, when she became pregnant with the oldest child, she said, I'm not having this baby on German soil. So she forced the husband to move to Detroit, right? He didn't want to move because actually he was building up a business there already. Wow. So he didn't want to move, right? But 500,000 people remain, right, in these machanot, right, displaced persons camp. Tachas shilton atzvoi shel benos habris, right, the allies, right, until they would get placed. They were displaced until they would get placed. Ve'im lo haisa medinas Yisrael kama hayu rubam kekulam nisharim sham. Most of them would have stayed there beglal hamachzor hagadol shel gvarim ekev hamilchama hayu agoyes muchanos litchatenim Yehudim elu. The German women were ready to marry the Jewish men because they lost so many men in the war. There wasn't enough men to go around, right? Hasig v'asiyach, right? The occupation and the talk the us that ala komas medinas Yehudis bekarov hu zeh shemana mahem litama bagayim. The talk, it was 1945. The Jewish state wasn't there, but there was a lot of talk about it in the Jewish state. Tons of talk. It says that kept these people from assimilating and marrying the Germans. That's exactly what you said that Reb Yaakov said, right? So when the people in my shul, right, I asked Reb Yaakov about the people in my shul saying Hal on Yom Ha'atzmaut. He said, of course. He said, if not for Medinas Yisrael, those people wouldn't exist anymore. After World War II, they would not exist. So they should say Hallel because Medinas Yisrael saved their religion. And that's what Reb Yosef here says. That's all nationalism. There's no question about it. Medinas Yisrael gave them nationalism, which they didn't have before. Living in Litva, Poland, Hungary, they didn't have any nationalism. Where was the nationalism? Right? They had Judaism, but they didn't have nationalism. This gave them something. Judaism was extremely weak at this time for obvious reasons. I mean, where was God? Right? It's the obvious reason. So if you're Reb Yaakov Kamenetsky or Moshe Feinstein, you try to answer that question, right? Rav Soloveitchik, right? Try to answer that question. But a simple person, he remains with that question, where was God? But then Medinas Yisrael comes, now I see God again, right? He fell asleep for a couple of years, but now he woke up, right? So that's what Rabbi Yosef here says, is that even for nationalistic reasons, this is the Chiddush of Rabbi Yaakov, even for nationalism, there's a schus in that. If you're a nationalistic Jew, there's a schus. So those 3 or 4 things that the Jews kept to themselves, Rabbi Yaakov says, was used as a schus, right? So he doesn't learn like the normal shot that we always understood, that, the Jews remained, they remained to be Rosh Hashivas and B'nai Torah, and they were in Egypt. You see, they didn't change. They kept kashrus and they kept Shabbos and they kept this, right? And that's why they got a gula, right? Rabbi Yaakov says, no way, right? No way. People who can't do Brit Milah, don't do Brit Milah, we're not going to call them from a mention. I'm sorry to tell you, okay? The most secular people today in America and Israel still do Brit Milah. I wouldn't say all of them, but the vast majority, right? So that they didn't do, who are you trying to kid, right? So obviously the other things were for nationalistic reasons. They wanted to look different, to be their own nation, but not a holy nation, okay? So now Reb Yaakov comes back to the Frum people, okay? Now you see the agenda again on the Frum people. Hayechidim sheshamru al ruchaniyotam b'Mitzrayim hayu Shevet Levi. Shevet Levi was different. Them, there was no nationalism. There was religiousism, right? Shevet Levi, and he proves it. Kemoshe ne'amar al shifta al Shevet Levi b'birchas b'bracha shel Moshe Rabbeinu ki shamru im rasecha. Shalovdu avodah zara, k'moshe nifsek Rambam hilchas akum perak aleph halacha gimel. Interesting, he says the quote the Rambam Paskins. That's a little bit strange to me. It's not the Rambam tells over the story of avodah zara there, and he says everyone started serving avodah zara chutz mishevet Levi, right? And he brings the pasuk, right? Ki shamru im rasecha shalovdu avodah zara, k'moshe Rambam. Ubrischa yintzoru, that's the end of the pasuk, right? Moshe Rabbeinu in his bracha to Levi, right? Ki shamru im rasecha ubrischa yintzoru. What does that mean? Shemalu b'neiim afil b'Mitzrayim. That's what it means. Kemoshe nifseka Rambam behilchas isurei bia perak yud gimel halacha beis. I don't know if you guys ever saw that, but the Rambam all of a sudden, this big posek of Ram starts going into Shevet Levi being different. Where does he do it? Hilchas Gerim. Well, how does he start Hilchas Gerim? It's in the middle of Isuri Bia, Hilchas Gerim, and he starts off by saying a ger needs 3 things. He needs Mila, a male ger, Mila, Tfila, and a korban. But if you don't have a korban, it's not ma'akiv. But he shows where the Jews had these 3 things. Mila, he says, that they had a Mitzrayim. And even though they stopped doing Mila Mitzrayim, Shevet Levi always did Mila Mitzrayim What, like it says in the pasuk, right? Like Moshe Rabbeinu said to the Bnei Levi, "Bris chayin tzora," they guarded your bris. Okay, he gets mamish off the topic over there for like a line or two to talk about this, that Shevet Levi was different. So Rabbi Yaakov deduces from the two places in the Rambam, right, that the Levi kept everything. They didn't serve Avodah Zarah. They kept Bris Milah. Why? Because they were coming from a Kedusha place. They had a responsibility to keep the Torah. Yaakov said to them, I'm making you, Levi, and your children responsible for the Torah. So they always felt that responsibility. So it wasn't nationalism. It was religiousiism. Okay? This is very interesting that Reb Yaakov says. And about the outer trimmings, Levi didn't care about that. They could walk around looking like an Egyptian. They didn't care. Why? Because that's superficial. I know inside of me, I have Torah, I have Avodah, I'm keeping the mitzvahs that I have in Egypt. I'm not serving Avodah Zarah, right? So he said, it's very funny that Reb Yaakov puts this in because like it opens up a little bit of a can of worms, right? That the real from person, you don't have to, his chitzonius doesn't have to be different than anybody else. Because Dafka today, in the yeshiva world, that's what makes us different. The yeshiva world is the black and white, and the Dati Lumi world is the colorful, right? But Rabbi Yaakov says, if you're really from, it doesn't matter what you wear. Very interesting piece of Rabbi Yaakov. He says like this, Ksharei al Moshe Rabbeinu amru benos Ruel, ish mitzri hatzilenu miyad haroim. When Yisro asked, so the kids, what did the kids say? Ish mitzri. How did they know he's an Ish Mitzri? Because he was dressed like a Mitzri. So normally you would say, obviously Moshe Rabbeinu grew up in the palace. So right. Of course he ran.
Yeah, like where, how is that a raya? Yeah.
So Reb Yaakov says, it's a good question. Reb Yaakov Kamenetsky doesn't take up that question, so I can't help you so much with it. But it's a very good question, right? It's an obvious question. But I think Reb Yaakov would say, right? Unless he's saying it al Pidrush, but I don't think he's saying it al Pidrush. I think Reb Yaakov would say, okay, so he went to a lot of places. He could have bought a new set of clothing, right? He didn't have to, have this Mitzrayim clothing on, right? So he says it didn't matter enough to him. That's what Reb Yaakov was learning. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't matter enough. By the way, the Chazal say, if I'm not mistaken, that Moshe Rabbeinu was not buried in Eretz Yisrael. And Yosef was. Why? Because Yosef said, Ganov gunafti meretz ha'ivrim, right? He identified himself as an Ivri. And Moshe, when they said that he was a Mitzri, he didn't correct them. So the Mefarshim should ask a question on that, because Yosef actually was born in Eretz Yisrael. I mean, he lived, in Eretz Yisrael. Moshe never lived in Eretz Yisrael. So but we're not going into that. But what's interesting about it is the Gemara, the Medrash doesn't say, because Moshe Rabbeinu dressed like a Mitzri. That was the problem. It says because he didn't re-identify himself when the girl said he's a Mitzri, right? So the dressing like a Mitzri, not a problem. I don't get bent out of shape about that. Superficiality, right? Which is good because, we always say the Jewish people are the nation of the book and not the nation of the look, right? Right?
Never heard that.
You never heard that? Michael Freud wrote an article called The Nation of the Book, the Nation of the Look. That's the article he wrote. There used to be the nation of the book, but now we're the nation of the look. Michael Freud. Anyway, okay. So he says, so that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't care. He was from Shevet Levi, right? So he didn't care. Okay. V'hine, im et hahevdel hagadol shemesoros ruchanit lebein idiyah shalumaniyut, right? The difference between, the great difference, he says, between a Masorah of spirituality and an idea of nationality, Ra'u Bizman Mashber. They saw it at a time, right? At a time of a Mashber means a crisis, right? That's what modern Hebrew, right? A Mashber means a crisis. When do you see the nafkamina, Reb Yaakov says, between nationalism and ruchaniyutism, right? Spiritualism, right? When they see it, only in a time of crisis. Otherwise, they may look the same. But at a time of crisis, it makes a difference. And Reb Yaakov says the following thing. This I never heard from Reb Yaakov, this part. Bechet ha'egel, sugyat chet ha'egel, what's a rub bizman mashber bechet ha'egel, sugyat chet ha'egel kosher hi v'lo mevinim ma ha'yesham. Right? The Chet Egel is very hard to understand because the Jews were in the middle of Matan Torah, and this is like not the type of break you usually take, right? So Hamafarshim mechapsim laktin et averu masbirim sherotzu la tachlif leMoshe Rabbeinu. You know, Rabbi Yaakov doesn't quote, but he brings the Kuzari, Ramban. Everybody tries to make the averu less. That's always our agenda is to try to make every Aveira in the Torah less than it was. We know this already, you know, that it's only really a Dakistic Aveira. If you look at it, it's not really an Aveira. In the yeshiva world, they love that. It comes based on the Alter of Slavotka, by the way. Dak Shebedak, he always says about an Aveira of Moshe Rabbeinu, it was Dak Shebedak, right? Arei Nivdak, right? So he says like this, Tachlich Moshe Rabbeinu. Avol besofo shel davar hayisham chet avodah zarah she'ansho b'misa she'ansho b'misa. At the end of the day, there was a there was a avera of the worst avera avodah zarah, which is punishment is death. Afal pisha bahar sinai arei nochiv lo yilecha mipi agvura shamanum. They heard the first two dibros from God Himself, not to serve avodah zarah. Avarega shel mashber, oh boy, she'omdim kishlosha milyonei bnei adam bamidbar. 3 million people are standing in the desert, men, women, and children. Below shum mishan lechem umayim, and there's no relying on any lechem umayim. It comes every day. The lechem comes down every day, right? One day it might stop coming down, right? You can't go to the bakery, right? Satan marelahem, according to Chazal, the Satan shows them the musmi tosuf shel Moshe. He shows them the bed of Moshe, like Rashi brings. Nichnesu lebehala. They went into panic. Okay, umiyad halchu litzar memale mokum leMoshe Rabbeinu. They wanted to find the Malay Mokum of Moshe Rabbeinu. And what was their first reaction? We have to do something magical. We have to do an Avodah Zarah in order to make the Malay Mokum. They reverted back to their old customs that they were very accustomed to for hundreds of years. Whether the mistake was this way or that way, according to the Ramban, according to Tuzari, Reb Yaakov says, I don't really care, what the Aveira was. One thing to me is very clear. Okay? At the time of a mashber, all their yearnings, okay, all their longings and yearnings for nationalism, right, didn't help. Right, that they should remain strong in their faith, even though Moshe's gone. The Golshu l'toch avodah zarah. They slid down, right? Liglosh, I guess that's what the internet, Liglosh at the internet.
No, you slip. But it's just like the Hatufim that were in Gaza. Every one of them seems that I wouldn't say they all became Orthodox Jews, but the way they talk about Emunah and Hashem.
Right, nationalism didn't work for them anymore.
Right. I mean, they had Jewish pride, but it was
right. But Jewish pride took a turn a little bit more into the halachic world for them. The guy made Kiddush on water. The guy made, he sang Zmiros on I don't know what, all of a sudden he remembered the 3 Zmiros he learned when he was 8, what I mean? Yeah. Rak Shevet Levi. Shemei Olam Shamru al Mesoras Ruchanit, right? Al Mesoras Ruchanit, Amdu B'Nisayon. Again, right? Moshe said, Mila Hashem Elai, Vayasfu Elav Kol B'nei Levi. How did that happen? That they didn't get it? He says, no, because theirs wasn't nationalistic. There was Kedushaistic, right? Kulam hoyu shavim. You could think that after Matan Torah, they were all equal. They all heard the Torah. They heard the Seres HaDivros. Sharei kulam amdu b'har Sinai. V'amasora shenishmara Dori Doris Eitz Levi Lo Sosif Lahem Yosemi Maimed Har Sinai Shekol Hashvatim Nochachu B'Shava Lahem. Right? One could think that, okay, Shevet Levi was great until Matan Torah, but at Matan Torah we're all the same now, right? Because we heard Aseres HaDibros, we heard God talk about Avodah Zarah, so we have that spiritual high now. We have that spiritual. We accepted that as spiritual ideology into ourselves. Aval Okain, Rabbi Yaakov says, I'm sorry, it's not true. HaMasoros Ruchanis HaZoshel Fnei Matan Torah. He Zosha Shomal Shevet Levi. Nostam Nekuda Pnimis Shemikocha Lo Nigraru Be'et Mashber Lecheta Ego. He says you can't just depend on Matan Torah. Matan Torah is a sound and light show, right? But Shevet Levi had this for hundreds of years, from the time of Yaakov Avinu, throughout the whole time of Egypt, right? That's what Reb Yaakov says held them, not the Torah of Matan Torah, the Torah that they had from Yaakov, from all the Shvatim, and from eventually the Torah itself, right? So that's what he says. Not lahem nekuda pnimis. It gave them. In other words, the Jews had everything on a superficial level. They had nationalism, which is superficial Judaism, and then they had superficial Torah because they just received the Torah. It didn't have time to really take effect on them. Whereas Shevet Levi, Rabbi Yaakov says, had hundreds of years, so it really took effect. And the kedusha of Yahadus was really very much part of them, right? So again, what Rabbi Yaakov is saying over here is that Dafka, the from world, right? That's the agenda, of course. Dafka, the from world that's coming at the Am Yisrael from a Makam Kedusha, even when it's going to become a crisis, there'll be a crisis, right? That'll hold up because the Torah holds up in a time of crisis, but nationalism doesn't. Okay? Now, I want to tell you something interesting. I'll read it to you in the English. Yeah, we have a little bit of time left. I'll read it in English. Professor Leo Levy, Yehuda Levy from, everybody knows Yehuda Levy. I'm sure maybe even heard him come to Chappelle's and speak on occasion. So he was, he was a big physicist. I think he was very big in optics, if I'm not mistaken. He wrote a number of books on optics, right? So he has a very famous work called Mulet Garei Hatkufa, which was translated into English, right?
Right. Great book.
In the first couple of chapters, he talks about nationalism and Zionism. He talks about how terrible nationalism is, right? But nationalism with Torah is not terrible, okay? But when he talks about Zionism, he says the following thing. It's translated, but it's verbatim from Rav Kook. Rav Kook wrote this. I forget which sefer. You can look in the index and see. Zionism will never be a stronghold for the whole nation because it intrinsically fails to grasp the holy, eternal light of the nation's soul, the spirit of the true God in its midst. This is Rav Kook. Thus, it will do well in the secular arena of building up a nation. That'll be great. To build a nation, nationalism is great. But it will never be able to deal with its spiritual side. That task stands ready for other workers of an entirely different type. These will develop from all the places out of the wilderness of the Haredim, those who faithfully and truthfully oppose Zionism. That's Rav Kook. Okay, nobody reads that Rav Kook to anybody. Professor Leo Levy.
Well, it is a bit inconvenient,
right? So that's what Reb Yaakov should have said, but he left everything. He gave the mashal without the nimshal, right? That's what he gave. And I want to tell you something interesting. Someone who's not, I wouldn't consider him really Haredi. I have an article he wrote. He wrote this article, I think, 20 years ago in the Jerusalem Post. eternally other, Rabbi Nathan Lopez Cardozo. Now, I don't know what the story is with him today. I haven't heard from him in a long
I
time.
think he wasn't well for, I don't know if how he's doing.
How he's doing. He's probably in his 80s already, I have a feeling. Right? So he writes, this is an unbelievably great article about the failure of Zionism. And like, he's not a Haredi guy in that sense. He's like his own man, right?
Yeah.
And he says, nowhere is the extreme spiritual crisis of the Jewish people more evident than in the state of Israel. A loss of purpose and direction has overtaken the vast majority of Israelis and most of its leaders, replaced by confusion and hopelessness, right? At the core of the crisis is a fundamental misreading of the Jewish people's nature and destiny. Okay, in other words, he goes into this whole thing of what we said about Ben Gurion, that they think their nature and destiny is to be like everybody else. And he says, the Jews have a destiny radically different from any other nation. They are an eternal nation with an eternal message, and their history is one of extreme abnormality. They're never going to be normal. That is why secular Zionism's attempt to normalize the Jewish people failed, will always fail. No nation can live on borrowed identity. That's what he says. It's nationalism, it's borrowed identity, right? And then he says, and indeed, there's no Israeli claim to the land. There can only be a Jewish claim. Okay? There's no Israeli claim, only a Jewish claim. They will have to see the land as a means and not as an end unto itself. Means to something else. It is ultimately an awareness of the radical otherness of the Jewish people that will ensure the Jewish future in the state of Israel. The abnormality and the otherness is what's going to do that. Okay? It will enable us to stand up to any external threat. Confusion will be replaced by certainty, bewilderment by calm.
Wow.
Okay? So that's Reb Yaakov, basically. I mean, this is what Reb Yaakov was saying, but him and Rav Kook say it a little bit more clearly out. Reb Yaakov it was all like to Reb Yaakov, it had to do with Egypt, it had to do with B'nai Levi versus the other people, but it was very clear that the B'nai Levi represents the Haredi world, right? It's coming from there, and the other. By the way, he does get into the national religious movement, that they're going to have a very big tafkid here, but they have to rise to the occasion. It can't but just be nationalism.
Right.
And when do you see it's just national? When there is sometimes when there's a crisis, that's going to be the test of the national religious world.
That's what's happening now. I mean, if you read that article 2 days before the war started, you would have cried because it was describing exactly where Israel was at. Today, there's like a little bit more clarity. I mean, they say, right, this is secular people talking, right? There's this woman who, she's a sociologist. She was just interviewed on TV about how Frumkeit is so popular among secular kids now. They're wearing tzitzis, they were going to slichos, and the girls are dressing more modest. I don't know how long it'll last.
Yeah, but you see that the real leftists go crazy from it.
Oh, it drives them crazy.
One principal wouldn't let a kid come in with its tefillin.
Right.
He wasn't wearing his tefillin. He had tefillin with him.
Yeah, so it drives them crazy. It's just like all the other stuff that's going on with the Supreme Court and Netanyahu, and that it's sort of like the old guard is giving up the last breaths. I
want to tell you something. I want to show you how sharp Rabbi Cardozo is. He says the attempt to transform that people into a normal nation in its own homeland has turned into a farce. In fact, is exploding right in the Israelis' faces. The oldest secular Zionist dream promised that once the Jews had their own homeland, anti-Semitism would cease to exist. But it has now become clear from the very existence of State Israel has become the main reason for anti-Semitism, right? And in here he says, look at this. But let us not get confused about confusion. The hopelessness is not the result of Israel's sudden realization that it has a Hamas state on its doorstep, or Iran is preparing to destroy our state. He wrote this 20 years ago.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy? 20 years.
But can I ask you a question? Because I've been reading a lot about Lakewood, right? And Tom's
Yeah.
River. And if you read what the Goyim write on my Yetzirah, I read these groups on Facebook where the Goyim talk about, so they're smart enough. They'll never say the word Jew. They're very careful, but it's clear that they're talking about the Yidden nonstop. Yeah, the way they drive and they this and they that and they really more and more hate the Jews. And I'm wondering, what is? I mean, those Jews. I know. I'm sure they're obnoxious. Okay, you go to Brooklyn, go to Passaic, everybody double parks, triple parks. I know
Yeah.
it's annoying.
You didn't see that thing from Fox News?
Which thing?
They did a Fox News thing. I can't tell the AI in there, right? But a Fox News reports that you won't believe what we just reporting now, that there's a fellow in Lakewood who's actually stopped at a stop sign and would take you over to our news reporter. And he says, this is true. Take a look. He stopped here right at a stop sign, something that is pushing unbelievable in this city.
Huh? So the thing is okay, so they're now hating Jews for very olam hazeh reasons. There's a lot of traffic in Lakewood that they didn't used to have.
Right. Florida too.
Overdevelopment. Everything's filled. There's traffic everywhere. Like people wrote nonstop. They wrote the only day we can drive is Saturday. That's what they wrote.
Right.
The thing is, so that's not really like Hashem zapping the Lakewood people because they're assimilating. I don't think you could say. I mean, maybe because they're into Gashmias. Like, what could be the reason that this anti-Semitism is waking up in Jackson and Tom's River and Lakewood?
Again, it could very well be because it doesn't. By the way, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Jews in Jackson or in Lakewood or in what's the other places? The third place, I forget what they call it, Tom's River, right? Yeah. It doesn't mean that they're at fault for the anti-Semitism.
No, they might be getting it because of us.
You know, the Jews in Eastern Europe living in a shtetl would take it to concentration camps and kill. I don't think it was their fault.
Right, 100%.
So,
it's almost like Rosh Katan.
Well, what'd you say, Jonathan?
I said they're getting it because they don't come here.
That is straight. In other words, what Jonathan is saying is that God is sending them a message.
I know, I hear it.
And that the galut in America, maybe in England as well, is finished. It's over.
But I'll tell you, they do not get it in Lakewood. There's
my gosh, I have tons of relatives there. I know that they don't get it.
It's so different in New York, City. At least some people, at least they think maybe we should move. All right, they're not coming here. They're going to go to Florida first.
They went to Florida, and now they're going to, of course, Houston, Texas.
Yeah, that's a biggie too.
Right, it's a biggie now, but Israel is not on the map yet. Like Jonathan.
Well, listen, I have to say, I'm amazed here. You know, since I've been living in Ramat Beit Shemesh, I meet all these olim, and I'm a little bit amazed that a lot of people come. They had successful lives in America, and they didn't really plan well for over here. I'm not talking about everybody because there's plenty of people who come here. They make impressive lives, both in education and parnasa and everything. But I'm amazed. It's not so pasha to come here. The rent, the buying a place, the mortgage. It's just.
Yeah, it isn't pasha. That's why in my podcast I said they don't have to come tomorrow, but they should already plan their lives to be in Israel, so they won't get caught exactly what you're describing. Right? If you have to run away from America and not the opposite, you run to Israel, but you're running away from America, then you may get caught with your pants down.
Right.
That's why you should be planning now. I know somebody in LA, right? He lives in the valley in LA, a doctor, and he said he already purchased his apartment. He has his apartment in there's a new area near Arnona. There's also, by the way, another area in Katamonim that's going up. Americans are going to be moving there, right? And all these people that are buying, I would say at least 50 or 60% are thinking, yes, I got to prepare my life in Israel. I'm not running tomorrow, but I got to prepare my life in Israel. That's what this doctor told me in LA.
Right. Josh Fass from Nefesh B'Nefesh told me that when he was this was last summer, not the one that just passed, the one before, he said that he was in Teaneck. He had private meetings with people about making Aliyah because they didn't want people to know.
Right.
But he met with 10 couples, 20 people. All of them were like on the verge. And that was Teaneck, you know. So, I mean, the war had already started. So,
yeah, even with the war and everything, right? People are seeing that in America, it's not what it once was.
It's unbelievable. I mean, it happens so fast.
And in England,
too.
for sure, they're seeing that. With the Muslims, they're seeing it. and they should be preparing, especially the ones that can afford it.
Right.
They should definitely be preparing themselves, to move, even if it never takes effect, because they really don't want to leave. But it looks bad right now. It looks
does.
like
Well, the model that a lot of French people,
right.
They were coming here, they bought apartments, their kids moved here and went to college for free because they're
Right.
But the
No,
parents
because
stayed in France.
in France, it's really bad.
Yeah.
France is worse than England, worse than the United States.
It's
So
probably the
therefore,
worst
of
place.
course, those smart people said we can't wait for the last minute. That's what
Right.
really is going on over here.
So
But I mean, Jonathan is correct that that's the message that they should be getting, but not
that's the Rabbi
necessarily getting.
Karlinsky. That's the Rabbi Karlinsky camp.
Right,
They're not,
right.
they're not getting the message.
But I told you that Reb Yaakov said about the Haredi world. He spoke to Aguda convention, and that's where he said his vort at the beginning of Sefer Shmos. Right? He said, if you get too comfortable, and that means Israel is not in your consciousness, Eretz Yisrael is not in your consciousness, he's going to put it in your consciousness. He's going to make sure. So you don't have to necessarily not keep Torah to assimilate for that to happen. Reb Yaakov was talking to the Frum Jews, to the Fried Jews.
So as my parents said when I was growing up, my parents always used to say, "You're cruising for a bruising."
Right, exactly. That's what I'm saying. That's what Reb Yaakov was saying. You get too comfortable in Golut, and you forget that you're in Golut. And if you go to Lakewood and you go to Jackson and you go, what's that other place I said that you go
Tom's
to?
River.
Tom's River. You feel that everybody is really, really comfortable. Okay, and one house is larger than the next. I mean, I was in one house. It was so huge. It was mamash. Unbelievable, right? And it was in Jackson, and it wasn't in the best neighborhood in Jackson, but the Jews in Jackson and Tom's River. I was in a Tom's River home that was like a swimming pool in the backyard, and it was unbelievable. The size of the home.
When I was growing up, those areas, I mean, forget Lakewood because that was like a resort, but like the other places, Tom's River was the most goyish you could get.
Right.
Like
it is completely goyish, and now
I
Jews
can't
bought
think
the
of
whole
anything
thing up.
more goyish.
Right. They bought it up, and Reb Yaakov was saying that they got very comfortable, and it's time to turn the screws in a little bit, and maybe a little more than a little bit. That's what's going on. Okay, guys, next week is Hanukkah.
Oh.
So we'll leave a week off for Hanukkah?
Yeah, it might be easier.
Okay, so we'll leave a week off, and we'll come later than that. I know all you guys have grandchildren already, and they have to stand online and get the Hanukkah gelt and stuff like Reb Yaakov used to give. Right? Reb Yaakov at 34. Probably you guys are getting up there too. Okay. Okay, we'll be in touch. Take care.
All right.